Think about the last thing you ate today. Maybe cereal, maybe coffee, maybe something you grabbed from a gas station without a second glance. You didn't check it for poison, you didn't have to. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you trust that someone, somehow made sure it wouldn't kill you. Here's the thing. For the first 130 years of the United States, that someone did not exist. There was no general federal law. Not one, stopping a company from putting almost anything it wanted into your food. No inspections of your groceries. No honest ingredient labels. No FDA. None. And yet America ate. Cities of millions were fed every single day. The country grew from 13 farming colonies into an industrial giant on food that no federal official had ever looked at. So what was actually in it? How did a mother in 1890 know her children's milk was really milk? How did anyone know their coffee was coffee? Their honey was honey? Their canned beef was, well, beef? And when people got sick, and they got sick, who was ever held responsible? This isn't just trivia. What happened in 1906 fundamentally rewired the relationship between you and every single thing you put in your body. It created an idea that was genuinely radical at the time, that the government stands between a manufacturer and your dinner plate. You've lived inside that idea your entire life, whether you've thought about it or not. The road to that moment runs through plaster of Paris and milk jugs, formaldehyde in nursery bottles, a squad of young men who volunteered to eat poison for their country, a novel that made a president push away his breakfast, and a showdown between the White House and the most powerful industry in America. So let me take you back to the beginning. Imagine you're a farm wife in Ohio in 1825. Almost nothing you eat is a mystery to you. The butter came from your own churn. The pork came from a hog you raised, slaughtered, and salted yourself. The flour came from the miller down the creek. A man you've known your whole life. A man who sits 2 pews over at church. A man who knows that if he cuts his flour with chalk, you'll know, your neighbors will know, and his business will be dead by spring. That, right there, was America's original food safety system. Not laws, proximity. When you can look your food supplier in the eye, honesty isn't a virtue, it's a survival strategy. And this is why the founders never wrote food safety into the federal government's job description. It wasn't carelessness. In a nation of farms and villages, food was about the most local thing imaginable, a matter for town markets, state courts, and personal reputation. The Constitution gave Congress power over commerce between the states, but in 1789, almost no food crossed a state line before it crossed your lips. The founders knew exactly what world they were designing for. It just wasn't the world that was coming, because then came the railroads. Between the 1840s and the 1870s, the distance between the person who made your food and the person who ate it exploded from a few miles to a few thousand. A family in a Manhattan tenement now drank milk from producers they'd never met, ate flour milled in Minnesota, bought coffee roasted by a company that existed, as far as they could tell, only as a name on a label. The eye contact was gone, and with it went the accountability. Now run the numbers the way a food processor in 1870 would have. Coffee beans are expensive. Chicory root, a roasted coffee-colored filler, costs a fraction as much. Chicory is a plant related to dandelions whose roasted root looks and pours like ground coffee. Mix in 20% and your profit jumps while your customer, hundreds of miles away, tastes almost nothing. Who's going to catch you? What law are you breaking? In most places, at the federal level, no law at all. So the cheating became an industry of its own. Grocers cut sugar with sand. Bakers whitened cheap bread with alum, an aluminum compound better known for pickling and tanning leather, and sometimes powdered chalk. Honey was frequently just glucose syrup with a dead bee dropped in the jar for authenticity. Think about that. The bee was a marketing decision. Canned peas were revived to a lovely fresh green with copper sulfate, a metallic salt also sold to kill fungus. Used tea leaves were collected, dried, re-dyed, and sold as new. Candy for children was colored with pigments containing lead and other heavy metals because those produced the brightest reds and yellows on the shelf. And food was only half of it. The same era gave America the golden age of patent medicines, brightly labeled cure-all tonics promising to fix consumption, colic, nerves, and female complaints. But here's the catch. Their makers didn't have to tell you what was inside. And what was inside was frequently alcohol, morphine, opium, or cocaine. Mothers spooned soothing syrups into teething babies without ever being told the active ingredient was a narcotic. The most notorious of them, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, contained morphine, and doctors of the era blamed it for infant deaths. Verify scale of the syrup's toll. It soothed all right, nobody was lying exactly, because nobody was required to say anything at all. Hold on to that detail too, because those unlabeled bottles are going to matter at the end of this story. To be fair, the picture wasn't lawless everywhere. It's important to say that some rules did exist. Congress had banned adulterated imported drugs back in 1848, and in 1890 and 1891 it passed narrow meat inspection laws, mostly to reassure European countries that kept banning American pork. Verify scope of the 1890 to 91 acts. Individual states had their own food statutes, but the whole thing was a patchwork. Different rules in every state, enforcement budgets that were basically rounding errors, and a simple loophole you could drive a freight train through. ship your product across a state line, and the state inspector's authority evaporated behind you. Into this gap walked a chemist. Harvey Washington Wiley, W.Y. Lee, was born in a log farmhouse in Indiana in 1844, the son of a farmer who read Greek by candlelight. Wiley became a doctor, then a chemistry professor at Purdue, then Indiana's state chemist, and in 1883 he arrived in Washington as chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture, a big title for what was then a small basement operation. And Wiley did something quietly radical. Instead of writing speeches, he started running tests. Beginning in 1887, his bureau published a running series of reports, known as Bulletin 13, that chemically analyzed everyday American groceries, category by category: dairy, spices, canned goods, coffee, whiskey, and printed exactly what was in them. Verify publication span of Bulletin 13. Not rumors. Lab results. The results said the cheating wasn't the exception. In category after category, it was closer to standard practice. But Wiley was up against something bigger than any one company, a philosophy, caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. In the 1880s, a huge share of American politicians and businessmen sincerely believed that what a man ate was between him, his grocer, and God, and that a federal government inspecting dinner tables was a step toward tyranny. Manufacturers liked the freedom, congressmen liked the manufacturers, and most ordinary people had no idea how bad things had gotten. So for decades, the uneasy arrangement held. The food was often fake, sometimes dangerous, but the country got fed, the economy boomed, and nobody with power saw a compelling reason to change anything. And that's where the trouble began. Because the first great crack in the system didn't come from Washington. It came from the milk. In the 1850s, New York City ran on milk the way it now runs on coffee. And here's a question worth sitting with. In a city of 500,000 people, decades before refrigerated trucks, where did all that fresh milk come from? It couldn't survive a long journey from the countryside in summer heat. So it came from inside the city. And the way it was produced is one of the most genuinely stomach-turning stories in American history. Whiskey distilleries in Manhattan and Brooklyn had a waste problem. Mountains of hot, spent grain mash left over from making liquor, called swill. Some businessmen had a bright idea. Build cow stables directly next to the distillery, pipe the steaming swill straight into the feed troughs. The cows eat the waste becomes milk, and two industries share one input. On paper, it's elegant. In practice, it was a horror show. Cows aren't built to live on hot distillery slop. Packed into dark stalls, many never seeing grass again, they sickened. Sores, rotting tails, ulcerated bodies. Some grew too weak to stand and were held up in slings so they could keep being milked right up until they died. Verify details of sling milking. The milk that came out of these animals was thin and bluish. So the dealers fixed it. A little water to stretch it, a little chalk or plaster of Paris to whiten it, sometimes molasses for color, and it went out on wagons cheerfully painted with the words "Pure Country Milk." Remember that phrase. We'll come back to it. Most of that milk went to the people who needed milk most, infants and small children in the tenements, and the children were dying. In May of 1858, a newspaper called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly sent artists and reporters into the swill stables and published what they found. Detailed engravings of the dying cows, the filth, the whole system, kicking off one of the first great expose campaigns in American journalism. Reformers of the era claimed swill milk was killing on the order of 8,000 infants a year in New York alone. Verify. This is the reformers' own figure. Modern historians consider it unverifiable. If that number were even half true, it would be like a modern city losing multiple classrooms of children every single week from something sold to their parents as wholesome. Now, the sober correction, because it matters. Historians looking back at this episode point out that the death statistics were essentially advocacy numbers. Nobody in 1858 could actually trace infant mortality to specific milk wagons, and tenement children were dying of many things at once. The horror of the stables was real and documented. The precise body count was propaganda. Both of those facts are true at the same time, and holding both is what separates history from a scary story. Here's what happened next, and it tells you everything about the era. The city launched an investigation, led in part by an alderman named Michael Toomey, a Tammany Hall politician who was friendly with the distillery dairies. Toomey's committee toured stables that had been tidied up for the occasion, and the swill milk trade was, in effect, whitewashed. Verify Toomey committee details. New York State eventually passed a milk law in the early 1860s. Enforcement was thin, and the federal government? It did nothing because under the thinking of the time, it had no power to do anything. Milk was local, the dyeing was local, case closed. But the political landscape was shifting beneath the surface because the next threat to the American dinner table wasn't going to be local at all. It was going to come out of a laboratory. By the 1880s and 90s, food had gone fully industrial, and industry had a problem: distance and time. How do you keep milk sweet and meat pink across days of shipping when refrigeration is still primitive and expensive? Chemistry offered an answer. Preservatives, borax, a mineral compound you might recognize today as a laundry booster, went into butter, ham, and canned meats. Salicylic salicylic acid, a cousin of aspirin, went into beer, wine, and canned vegetables. Sodium benzoate went into ketchup and juice. And for milk, some dealers reached for the most efficient preservative on the market: formaldehyde. Yes, that formaldehyde, the fluid undertakers used to embalm the dead. A few drops kept milk from souring for days, masked the taste of spoilage, and cost pennies. Newspapers gave the product a nickname: embalmed milk. None of this required anyone's approval. No safety testing existed because no law required safety testing. The stuff went straight from the chemical supplier into the food supply, and the first large-scale experiment on whether daily doses of formaldehyde harm human beings was run, unwittingly and without consent, on the American public. In Indiana around the turn of the century, the state health officer, a crusading doctor named John Hurdy, Hur-T, began publicly blaming preserved milk for waves of children's deaths, and Indiana's fights over embalmed milk became national news. Verify specifics of the Indianapolis deaths and dates, but here's the detail most people overlook. The scandal that truly moved the country wasn't about children at all, it was about soldiers. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain, and the Army bought enormous quantities of canned and chemically treated refrigerated beef to feed the troops in Cuba. The meat, by the soldiers' account, was revolting: stringy, foul-smelling, sometimes rotten under a chemically preserved surface. Men sickened. And in that war, disease was already doing the real killing. For every American soldier who died from enemy fire, several times as many died of illness. Verify ratio: battle deaths were a few hundred, disease deaths were in the thousands. After the war, the Army's commanding general, Nelson A. Miles, went public with an explosive accusation. The Packers had shipped the troops embalmed beef, meat doctored with chemicals. A military court of inquiry was convened, and one of the witnesses was a young colonel, fresh from leading the Rough Riders up the heights outside Santiago, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt testified about the canned beef his own men could barely choke down, saying he would have preferred to eat almost anything else on hand. Verify his exact testimony wording. The inquiry ended murkily. The chemical charges were never conclusively proven, and some historians argue the beef was more spoiled than poisoned. But the phrase embalmed beef burned itself into the public's memory and into Roosevelt's. The scandal faded, as scandals do. Congress still passed no general food law. The preservative business kept growing, and that might have been the end of the story, except that down in the basement of the Agriculture Department, Harvey Wiley had come to a cold conclusion. Nobody in power would act without proof no one could wave away. So in 1902, with a small appropriation from Congress, he decided to manufacture that proof, using live human beings. Wiley recruited 12 young men, mostly healthy young clerks and civil servants, and made them an offer that sounds like satire. Free meals, 3 times a day, cooked by the government, with a catch. Mixed into those meals, in carefully measured and steadily increasing doses, would be the very chemicals sitting invisibly in America's groceries. Borax first, then salicylic acid, sulfurous acid, saltpeter, copper salts, and eventually formaldehyde. The volunteers pledged to eat nothing outside the test kitchen, submitted to constant weigh-ins and medical exams, and carried around collection bottles so the chemists could analyze, well, everything that came out of them. Officially, it was the hygienic table trials. The newspapers had a better name: the Poison Squad. The press went wild for it. Here were a dozen clean-cut young men cheerfully sitting down each evening to a well-cooked dinner seasoned with embalming fluid in the name of science. A catchphrase attached itself to the squad: "Only the brave dare eat the fare." Verify origin and exact phrasing of the slogan. And Wiley, a bearish, quotable man, became a minor national celebrity. Behind the jokes, the data piled up, and it was ugly. At the doses being tested, the volunteers developed headaches, stomach pain, nausea, loss of appetite, and weight. The borax trials alone left several of the men too sick to continue. Verify. Wiley's formal conclusion was measured but devastating. These preservatives, consumed steadily, were harmful, and they were in everything. Pause on the strangeness of this for a second. It was easier, in the America of 1902, for the government to feed poison to its own employees than to pass a law asking companies to stop putting poison in food. That's not a joke. That's an accurate description of the legal situation, and it's worth saying plainly that the experiment itself would never be approved today. No controls, real harm, and volunteers whose consent came wrapped in a free meals Deal's offer aimed at men earning clerks' wages. Wiley now had headlines and data. Industry had lobbyists and votes. Food bills kept passing the House and quietly suffocating in the Senate, where men like Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, the chamber's most powerful voice for business, stood in the doorway. What the reformers needed was something no lobbyist could out-argue. What they got, in February 1906, was a novel. Upton Sinclair was a broke 27-year-old socialist writer who had spent about 7 weeks embedded in Chicago's meatpacking district, living among the immigrant workers of Packingtown. The book he produced, The Jungle, was meant to be about them, about wage slavery, crushed lives, the human beings the machine consumed. But woven through the story were scenes from inside the packing houses: spoiled meat rechristened and resold, sausage made from refuse swept off the floors, rats and rat poison going into the hoppers, and, in the novel's most infamous passage, exhausted men slipping into open rendering vats and going out to the world as lard. Sinclair intended a socialist awakening. What he triggered was national nausea. As he famously put it afterward, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." The book detonated. Sales of meat dropped, by some accounts dramatically, with claims of domestic sales falling by as much as half in the following weeks. Verify figure, widely repeated, weekly sourced, and European governments began moving against American meat imports. Verify. And in the White House sat exactly the wrong president for the Packers, Theodore Roosevelt, the man who had personally tasted the Army's canned beef in Cuba. And then it became a duel. Roosevelt didn't actually trust Sinclair. He found the young man's socialism grating and suspected the novel's worst scenes were invented. So he did something shrewd. He sent his own eyes. In the spring of 1906, Roosevelt quietly dispatched 2 investigators to Chicago: Charles P. Neal, N-E-E-L, his commissioner of labor, and a reform-minded social worker named James Bronson Reynolds, with instructions to show up unannounced and see for themselves. The Packers found out anyway and scrambled to scrub the plants before the visits. Verify. It didn't matter. What Neal and Reynolds reported back was, in its dry, bureaucratic way, almost worse than the novel. Meat handled on filthy floors, privies opening near the workrooms, no meaningful sanitation, product going out the door that no inspector had ever seen. They couldn't confirm Sinclair's men into lard scene. They didn't need to. The everyday reality was damning enough. Now Roosevelt had a loaded weapon, and he used it exactly the way you'd expect Theodore Roosevelt to use it. A tough meat inspection amendment, written with Senator Albert Beveridge, Bever I.J. of Indiana, sailed through the Senate. Then it hit the House Agriculture Committee, chaired by a wealthy New York cattleman congressman named James Wadsworth, W.H.D.Z. Worth, a friend of the packing interests. Wadsworth's committee took Beveridge's bill and gutted it, shifting inspection costs to taxpayers, stripping requirements, and adding provisions that would let packers tie up inspectors' rulings in court, verify exact provisions. Wadsworth pronounced his version a fair and workable law. Roosevelt's reply in writing was that the committee had produced provisions so bad they seemed designed to defeat the whole purpose of inspection, verify exact wording of the Roosevelt-Wadsworth exchange. And then came the threat. Roosevelt was holding the Neal Reynolds report back from the public like a grenade with the pin half pulled, and everyone in Washington knew it. Publish it in full, and the meat market, already staggering, might collapse outright, at home and abroad. In early June 1906, Roosevelt released the report's first portion. The effect was immediate. Headlines worldwide, foreign buyers recoiling, and packing house allies in Congress suddenly doing arithmetic about what another installment would cost. It was a president openly leveraging an industry's nightmare against its own lobbyists. And it worked. The Packers' resistance cracked. Here's the part that will complicate the movie version, though, and it's important to say it. Later historians, most famously Gabriel Kolko, K.O. Shelko, in the 1960s, pointed out that the big Chicago Packers weren't purely victims of regulation. Many of them had wanted federal inspection for years, because a government stamp of approval was the one thing that could win back terrified European customers, and because the costs of compliance fell hardest on their smaller competitors. In other words, the Giants lost the Battle of 1906 and quietly won the war for market share. The dramatic version, crusading President crushes evil industry, is real. The sober version, sophisticated industry adapts regulation to its own advantage, is also real. American history is usually both at once, which brings us to a single Saturday at the end of June 1906, the day the old world ended. For the food bill itself, the broader one, covering everything from milk to medicine, the decisive vote had actually come months earlier. On February 21st, 1906, after years of burial in committee, the Pure Food and Drug Act passed the United States Senate by a vote of 63 to 4. Verify vote count. Sit with that margin for a second. In today's Senate, a genuinely contested bill scraping together 60 votes is treated as a miracle. 63-4 is the kind of number you only see when opposing a thing has become politically radioactive, a measure that had been successfully strangled for over a decade. Versions of it had died in Congress again and again since the 1880s, suddenly passed with almost no one willing to vote no in daylight. That's what The Jungle, the Poison Squad headlines, and years of Wiley's lab reports had done. They hadn't just changed minds, they'd made the old position unspeakable. Nelson Aldrich, who had once framed the whole idea as an attack on liberty, the question, as he put it, of whether Congress should dictate what a man may eat and drink, verify exact quote, read the room and stepped aside. The House followed on June 23rd by 240 to 17, verify vote count, with the meat inspection fight raging in parallel. And on June 30th, 1906, President Roosevelt signed two laws within the same day, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. 130 years after independence, the United States federal government had, for the first time, taken general responsibility for what was in the nation's food. Now, what did the law actually do? Less than you'd think, and that's worth being precise about. The Pure Food and Drug Act did not create an approval system. Nobody had to prove anything was safe before selling it. What the law banned was adulteration and misbranding in interstate commerce. You could no longer secretly pad, dye, or preserve food with hidden substances, and your label could no longer simply lie. And remember those patent medicine bottles that didn't have to say anything at all? That ended too. Dangerous ingredients like morphine, opium, and cocaine now had to be declared right on the label. And once mothers could read the word morphine on a bottle of baby syrup, the soothing syrup business began to die of honesty. Enforcement went to Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry, which grew over the decades that followed, and in 1930 took the name it carries today, the Food and Drug Administration. When you hear FDA, you are hearing the great-grandchild of a basement lab that once fed borax to volunteers. The aftermath is a story of acceleration. The idea took root and never went away. Wiley himself, ironically, didn't last. Worn down by fights inside the government over how aggressively to enforce the law, he resigned in 1912 and spent his remaining decades running consumer protection testing for Good Housekeeping magazine, where his team's seal of approval became famous, verify his exact role. And here's a fascinating detail most people don't realize. The 1906 law's biggest weakness, no requirement to prove safety in advance, stayed on the books for another generation, until it was paid for in lives. In 1937, a Tennessee company sold a liquid children's antibiotic called elixir sulfanilamide, sulfanilamide, dissolved in a sweet-tasting industrial solvent, diethylene glycol, that turned out to be a deadly poison. No one had tested it because no law said they had to. More than 100 people died, many of them children, verify Toll. Within a year, Congress passed the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, requiring proof of safety before a product reaches the market, the system you live under right now. So, the balanced verdict. The old caveat emptor men were partly right. The 1906 settlement did entrench the biggest producers, did give birth to a bureaucracy that has grown for a century straight, and did put decisions about your dinner into the hands of officials you will never meet. But they were also unmistakably wrong about the thing that mattered most. The free market had been given 130 years to keep plaster out of milk and formaldehyde out of baby bottles, and it hadn't done it. The wagons, remember, said pure country milk. The market didn't punish that lie. The market printed it in cheerful lettering, and before 1906, if you'd asked how many federal officials stood between a manufacturer and your dinner plate, the answer was the same word we started with: none. When you zoom out and look at this whole arc, the swill stables, the poison squad, the novel, the signature on June 30th, 1906, you realize this story was never really about food. It was about trust, and what happens to trust when a society scales up. For most of human history, you trusted your food because you trusted people. The miller you knew, the neighbor who sold you eggs, the butcher who couldn't afford to poison the only town he'd ever live in. The railroad and the factory didn't just move food farther. They dissolved that web of personal accountability, and for half a century, nothing replaced it. The adulteration era wasn't caused by Americans suddenly becoming villains. It was caused by a system where strangers fed strangers and nobody was watching. What 1906 really invented was a substitute for the village, trust industrialized, a stranger in a government lab standing in for the neighbor you no longer had. And there's one more debt this story owes before we close it out. The workers, the people in Sinclair's packing town, the Lithuanian, Polish, and Slovak immigrants working brutal hours in the cold and the stench. were the reason the jungle was written, and they're the part of the story America chose to forget. The country read a book about their crushed lives and responded by protecting its own dinner. The meat got inspected. The men and women cutting it waited decades longer for their protections, Sinclair noticed. It's the bitter joke inside his famous line about aiming for the heart and hitting the stomach. Now bring it all the way to your kitchen. The next time you're holding a package of food, actually look at it. The ingredient list you skim past, the name of the manufacturer, the government-mandated honesty printed in small type on nearly everything you consume. That label is not a formality. It's a 120-year-old peace treaty, the settlement of the war this video just described, between you and the strangers who feed you. Every line of it exists because, at some point, somebody lied about what was in the jar, and enough people finally decided that buyer beware wasn't good enough for a world where the buyer couldn't possibly know. Was the old world better or worse? Honestly, it depends entirely on what you value. If you prize a world where no official stands between a willing seller and a willing buyer, where your protection is your own judgment and your neighbor's reputation, then 1906 is the year that world started dying, and everything since, the agencies, the approvals, the recalls, the rules, is the bill. If you prize being able to hand a bottle of milk to a child without running a chemistry test first, then 1906 is the year America grew up. Both views are honest. Both have costs. The people who warned that the regulatory state would never stop growing were right. The people who said the market alone would never protect a tenement baby were also right. Which leaves us where these stories always leave us, with the question that never gets settled, only re-argued by each generation. Someone will always decide what's safe enough for you to eat, to buy, to take. The only question is who? The seller? The state? You? And whoever holds that power. In whose interest are they really using it? In 1858, the answer was hiding in a Brooklyn cow stable. In 1906, it was fought over between a president and a committee chairman. Today, it's being argued about right now, somewhere in Washington, over things you'll be eating next year. The question is as alive at your grocery store this week as it was when the wagons rolled out painted with "Pure Country Milk." If this story changed the way you see something as ordinary as a food label, you belong here. Subscribe. On this channel, we go deep on the hidden systems that shape your world. The laws, institutions, and quiet historical fights that decided how your money, your food, and your daily life actually work in ways most people never stop to think about. And speaking of things nobody was watching, until 1938, there was no prescription requirement in America. You could walk into a pharmacy and buy almost anything over the counter. That story is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it.